So the very first thing I ask myself as a persuader in a given situation is, what is the likelihood that people are going to be thinking about what I have to say?
Welcome to the Leadership Initiative, where we explore the art and science of leadership through thought-provoking conversations with experts, thought leaders, and changemakers. Whether you're a seasoned leader or just starting out on your leadership journey, this podcast is designed to provide you with the tools and inspiration you need to lead with purpose and make a meaningful difference.
So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Richard Petty, who, these introductions are always sort of difficult, I think, for the presenter, because I could spend the whole podcast talking about Dr. Petty's contributions to psychology. So I'll do the brief version and stick to the facts. Dr. Petty really is one of the world's most renowned psychologists, and he has so many awards and fellowships and accolades that I could spend a long time reciting those. He's also one of the most cited psychologists alive today. And one of the, he's made contributions in many areas, particularly in the area of social attitudes. But I would say what he's best known for is his work on the Elaboration Likelihood Model that he developed with Dr. Cacioppo, and that's what we're going to talk to him about today, and its implication for attitude change, persuasion, and communication. So, Rich, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for that, Tim. I appreciate it.
Sure. So the first question I have for you, Rich, is, can you describe for the uninitiated the kind of a brief overview of the Elaboration Likelihood Model, which we can call the ELM, and how it explains the process of persuasion?
Sure. There are a couple of core ideas behind the model, and probably the most important one, and the one for which it's most well known, is just the simple idea that if you're trying to influence someone or persuade someone, there's sort of two fundamental ways, or what you have to consider is how much thinking the person is going to be doing about your message. And so in the bare bones version, it distinguishes between high thought persuasion where a lot of thought takes place, or persuasion where relatively little thought takes place. And there are different processes and mechanisms and things you can do once you diagnose where people fall along that elaboration continuum, from very high to very low, or maybe sometimes somewhere in the middle. And so that's sort of the core idea. And then the model will then break down, well, what are some of those high thought processes? What are some of the things that happen under high thought? And what are some of the things that happen under lower thought? And so that's sort of the second part of the model, unpacking how do you get people to be in the high thought or low thought situation? And then if you get them to be high thought, what do you do? If they're low thought, what do you do? So that's sort of one core idea. And the reason the theory says we care whether people are in the high thought or the low thought mode, and this is sort of maybe the second big idea from the theory, is that the more thought that goes into persuasion, the stronger that persuasion is. And so what I mean by stronger is the persuasion is more likely to last over time, as opposed to be there right now, but then disappear tomorrow. And so a lot of advertising uses low thought mechanisms, and that's why you have to keep repeating it, because it's a low thought mechanism, and so it doesn't last very long. Whereas if you could make it a higher thought persuasion, it might last longer, and so you wouldn't have to advertise as much or put in-store reminders of what's going on, because it would stick with people. So it'll just last longer. That's one of the consequences of higher thought persuasion. It's harder to talk people out of their attitude if it's based on high thought, because they're able to defend their position, as opposed to people who had an initial low thought change. It sort of bounces around. And so I hear this, and then I go this way, then I hear something else, and I go the other way. and so it's not as stable because you succumb to attacks. And the third thing that's good about high thought persuasion is it gives people the confidence to act on their attitude. Right. So let's say someone's about to make a decision to buy a car, and there was a bunch of ads, and they sort of have a positive attitude toward this particular car. But before they purchase it, they'll ask themselves something like, am I sure that this is a good car? And if they ask themselves that question, as people often do when they're about to make a consequential decision, that confidence won't be as high if they haven't put thought, if the change came about by a lower thought mechanism. So those are kind of the two big things. There's high and low thought persuasion, and it's consequential for how strong the change is. And then you can unpack each of those high and low thought mechanisms a bit more.
Yeah, great. Now, Rich, as you well know, having developed it, the model has been around for really like a generation of researchers now, and there have been literally thousands of studies that have used it. So my next question is kind of hard to answer given that, but how has the model evolved since you first introduced it?
So most of the research since the first research focused on how to get people to be in higher or low thought situations. And so a lot of variables were discovered. Like one of the main reasons or main ways to get people to think more about it is to make the message seem more personally relevant. So connect it to people's lives or their values or their identity or something connected to them. And so they go, oh yeah, this message is for me. And so they start to think about it more. So the sort of first generation of research did that, like what gets people to think and not think, and what are some of the simple strategies that would work under low elaboration conditions? Like, do people use their emotional state as a heuristic? I feel good, so I must like the product if they feel good. So try to unpack those things. But in the last, say, 15 years or so, the biggest evolution of the theory was whereas we first focused on, do you have a lot of thoughts about the message? And if so, those thoughts will be determinative, or do you not have thoughts? But the last 15 years, we sort of discovered that sometimes people have thoughts, they have a lot of thoughts, and they're being very thoughtful about the message, but they don't use those thoughts. So we initially assumed, like, well, if you're being thoughtful, you would use your thoughts. But the correlation under very high thinking conditions between the thoughts, whether they're positive or negative, and what attitude or behavior you engaged in, might only be a correlation of 0.5 or 0.6, which is not terrible in social science. And initially we thought, well, that's sort of what you can expect, a lot better than 0.3. 0.6 is good. And there's always measurement error and things you could say, well, it's not. But later we started to think that, well, maybe there's a reason. And maybe some people use their thoughts and some people don't use their thoughts. And so I had mentioned the concept of sometimes people don't have enough confidence in their attitude to engage in a behavior. So we took that simple idea and said, well, maybe some people don't have enough confidence in their thoughts to use them to form their attitude. So maybe having thoughts isn't sufficient for high thought persuasion. You have to have enough confidence in the thoughts. And so in the last 15 years or so, we've been, so that notion was always there in the model. So it's something that was kind of there. You have thoughts and then you have to use them. But we kind of mostly assumed that, well, people will use them if they have them. And so that aspect of the model, which was there as an assumption, has been unpacked. And so we've done another 15 years of research, culminating in this review paper we did published in 2020 that summarizes that last 15 years of research on what gets people to use their thoughts. And so, as you might imagine, there's some individual differences that determine things. Like some people are just more confident individuals. They're confident in everything, and so they just tend to use their thoughts more because they're more confident in them. Other things you can do to make people more confident. So we wanted to not just measure confidence, because then you have a correlational study. You want to see if you can randomly assign people to have high or low confidence in their thoughts and see if you can cause them to use their thoughts more or less than they might have in a control condition. And it turns out there's a bunch of different things that lead people to be more confident in their thoughts. And so they could be as simple as, in one study, we got people to sit in a chair and sit up straight in sort of a high chair, like an executive chair, as opposed to they're sitting in a lower chair in a sort of a subordinate or an assistant's chair. And then we had them think positive or negative thoughts. And the people sitting in the high executive chair used their thoughts more to form their judgments than the people who were sitting in the lower non-executive chair, because they felt more confident. So confidence isn't just an individual difference. It's also something that you can manipulate. And so we've now done 15 years of research to look at what are some of the ways to enhance, not to change the thoughts themselves, right? But to get you to use those thoughts or to discard your thoughts. And so for persuasion, if someone's normally generating positive thoughts because you have, let's say, a very strong message, you really want them to feel confident about those thoughts, so they'll use them more. But if they're thinking negative thoughts and they're doing a lot of counter arguments to your message, and that's what they normally would be doing, you want them to doubt those negative thoughts so they don't use them as much. And so whether you want people to feel confident or not while they're listening to the message matters, depending on what kinds of thoughts they're doing. And there are just a bunch of different things you can do situationally or in the environment to put people in a sort of confident sense or non-confident sense. And they range from things like I mentioned, where you sit. If I put you in a good mood after you've listened to a message and you'd have positive thoughts, you then sort of misattribute that positive feeling to your thoughts, and you think, oh yeah, I like those thoughts. Whereas if you're feeling sad, you think, I don't like those thoughts, and so you don't use them anymore. So that's probably the biggest evolution. There are various studies we did about what are all the consequences of high or low thinking, and so we've tried to unpack those a bit since the beginning. But the major new idea that's generated a lot of research is this idea that people have to either feel confident in or feel like they like their thoughts so that they will use them more.
I think, Rich, that's really relevant to new developing leaders. In the leadership area, there's this concept called leader identity, whether someone really sees themselves naturally as a leader. And, particularly, I think for students who may enter, their college years and beyond, kind of low social capital, they've just not been given opportunities to lead and so forth. That element of being a confident leader, it's also work on leadership, self-efficacy, and seeing yourself as a leader. It's really relevant to what you're talking about, I think, because it's one thing to be persuaded and to think about something in a way that's pretty sticky, but as you put very well, then acting on it, that's ultimately, where we're going to see the results of the whole, desired process, really.
Right. Yeah. And I can imagine simply reminding people of their leadership role will sort of make them feel responsible and confident. And so they're more likely to act on their thoughts. Yeah.
So, Rich, what are some common misconceptions of your model and that you've encountered in your research? So people kind of learn about your model, or researchers have studied it. When are the times you've kind of shaken your head and said, no, that's really not what we're saying here. That's not right.
Yeah, misconceptions. That's a good one. And there are a few. Maybe I'll talk about two. The first one that sort of came about, and I think this is partly our fault, because we talked about two routes to persuasion. That was sort of the subtitle of the Elaboration Likelihood Model, as I mentioned, sort of high thought and low thought. And it's natural to try to put things into two buckets. Is this high thought or is it low thought? But our intention was, in calling it Elaboration Likelihood, was to say, no, there's a continuum of thought. And it goes from one end, very low, to the other end, very high. But of course, someone could be in the middle, and you could give a medium amount of thought to something. And so one misconception was that, well, you either have to be one or the other. And so you either get totally cue-based persuasion or you totally get thoughtful persuasion. And the intent was like, well, no, that's what you get on each of the ends of the continuum when you moved really high or you moved really low.
Kind of like that age-old binary thinking that we all tend to fall into at times.
Binary thinking, and ironically, later we had this whole explosion of dual system theories, and they really were trying to put people into buckets and say it's system one or it's system two, and so that, and then we got lumped in with those theories who were saying that, but we were referring to this continuum, so that if you're kind of in the middle, you could have some simple cues affect you and some thinking, so you could have some sort of combination of each. But when we did the studies, we tried to push people to one end or the other so you could clearly see the two different kinds of processes, never to say that you couldn't get both operating together. And so there was a period of a decade or so where people kept writing about this theory's wrong because it's one or the other, and we found they're a little of both. And we're going, yeah, that's because you're in the middle of the continuum of likelihood there. Anyway, so that was sort of a first one, and that one I think people have caught on to, and so that misconception doesn't occur as much. But the second thing that's almost an outgrowth of that, the two buckets, the thoughtful and non-thoughtful persuasion, is people, and you see this one in textbooks a lot, that they want to try to get a persuasion variable. I'll explain what that is in a second, and say, is that variable, does that go in the low thought bucket or does that go in the high thought bucket? Right, so let's take a variable. By a variable, I mean like how attractive the message source is. That would be a variable, right? And so the question would be, how does that variable, or the color of the room, or everything could be a persuasion variable, right? It could be part of the source of the message or the context in which you are. So those are all the different variables. Things that are under our control as a persuader. What source do we pick, and what kind of arguments do we have, and what kind of background do we put the message on, and so forth. And so people wanted to put those in buckets, and I'll give you an example. So people would write and they'd go, oh, emotion. Emotion is a low effort mechanism because if people are happy, then they just like things, right? And we'd go, well, yes, if they are on the low end of the continuum, then if they're feeling happy, then they might just say, I like it. Or if they're in the low end of the continuum and they see an attractive source, they might say, oh, I like that person, so therefore I'll like the product. Or if my doctor's attractive, I'll just go along with whatever my doctor says. And that's all there is to it. They don't process any of the arguments or reasons. And so all of those variables could be put in the low thinking bucket. But those same variables can do other things. And so, for example, take an attractive source. Let's say you're watching an ad for a shampoo, and the source is very attractive and has lovely hair. And you really are considering changing your brand. And so you're being very thoughtful. In that case, the attractiveness of the source could serve as an argument. And so you're not going along just because the source is attractive. It's because you're thinking, oh, look how well that product worked on that person. And I want my hair to be like that person's hair. And maybe it would be if I use the product. So that's a very high thought use of the very same variable, an attractive source. Or similarly, you can use, now, if the attractive source is recommending a new bank to put your money in, then that attractive source can't serve as a positive argument, right? For most people anyway, because there's no relevance of the attractiveness to the interest rate that the bank has or how safe it is to put your money there. It can only serve as a simple cue. And so sometimes variables can't serve in one role, or they're more likely to serve in one role than the other. But the main idea is that virtually any variable could be put in either bucket. Put you in a good mood, yeah, if you're not thinking, it serves as a simple cue. But when people are thinking a lot, what research shows is that being in a good mood biases your thoughts in a positive direction, because it's easier to access positive stuff in the brain when you're feeling good, because positive things tend to be connected and separated from the negative stuff in the brain. There's that bivalent kind of thing. So that's a second conception, and there, as I mentioned, lots of textbooks that try to say, well, here's a list of low effort things, and here's a list of things you could introduce in the situation if people are thinking. And mostly, there are just always exceptions, but almost any variable could serve along that continuum. And so on the low end, they serve as simple cues. On the high end, they bias thinking, or they serve as arguments themselves. And in the middle, often in the middle of the continuum, we don't know how much to think. And so if a person first gets a message and they already know it's unimportant, they're not going to think. Or if they know it's important, they're going to think, okay. But maybe they don't know. And so an attractive source, research shows, sometimes can motivate people to think. And you go, oh, I kind of like that person, so I'm interested in what they have to say, so I'm going to pay more attention. And then that attractive source moves them from the middle of the continuum up toward the high end of the continuum. Or could be, I don't like that person at all, so I don't want to listen to. I was open to listening, but as soon as I see who the source is, I go, I don't want to listen to that person at all, and it pushes you to the low end. And so those are all different things, and don't want to get into this because it gets more complicated, but there are overall 5 different things the elaboration likelihood model outlines that variables can do. And so we've talked about a couple of them: biasing thinking, or serving as a cue, or motivating thinking, and so forth. And so depending on where you are along that elaboration continuum, the variable could do one of those 5 different things.
Yeah.
So that's kind of complicated, right? It's easier to put things in buckets.
Sure.
And so it's an easy one to misunderstand. But if we just think, nope, don't put variables in buckets, every variable could do one of 5 different things.
The problem that you're talking about, Rich, though, is that also that then when somebody tries to apply this, which is where my next question is going to be going, if we're thinking about it too simplistically, you're going to really, I think, misapply or misappropriate the model. You'll say, oh, because the speaker is attractive, or because they told a joke and put me in a good mood, that means that I'm outside of thinking about this in any sort of deep way. It must be a superficial when what you're saying is, no, those are relevant variables that may facilitate or hinder certain processes we're interested in, but it just isn't that simple. And it's like real life.
Yeah, that's right. And so for application, right, which is what, most people maybe who aren't people who study this for a living are interested in. How do I apply this? I always tell people the very first thing I do if I'm going into a situation and I want to, someone asks me, well, how do I persuade X? And there, as you mentioned earlier on in the intro, there's tons of things that persuasion is relevant to, right, every day in our lives. And people are trying to persuade us all the time. So the very first thing I ask myself as a persuader in a given situation is, what is the likelihood that people are going to be thinking about what I have to say? All right, so I go down my checklist of variables, like, is this message going to be personally relevant to people? Am I talking to them one-on-one where they won't be distracted? Is the room going to be amenable for people to think, or are there going to be lots of distraction present? And so there's a list of 25, 30 variables I can think about and try to say, okay, where's the average person of the audience, or this person in particular, if I'm just looking at one person or small group, where do they fall along this continuum, right? Are they likelihood of not thinking much about it, in which case I know I'm going to need to rely on simple cues? Are they going to be at the high end, or I'm going to say, oh, it's my arguments that are really going to be important? So I start to think about what kind of arguments are going to be persuasive to these people. So I need to know about them and what their issues are and what their values are, and so forth. Or what cues are important to them? What groups do they identify with? What kind of sources can I use? Because I know they're not going to be thinking about it, so I have to rely on simpler mechanisms. Or if I think they're kind of in the middle and I have really good arguments, then my challenge is, oh, maybe there's something I can do to push them to the higher end, because I really want them to pay attention to my argument? So is there something I can do to make the message more relevant, or to free them of distractions, or to present the message in a simpler way so that it's easier to understand? So I'll take all my motivational and ability variables to see if I can push them up. Sometimes I might think, I don't really have the greatest arguments for this audience in particular, so that's not going to work, because I know they're going to counter argue all my arguments. So maybe I want to push them to the lower end of thinking. And there's some lots of interesting anecdotes where attorneys sort of know this spontaneously, that sometimes they want the jury to pay attention to particular information they're getting, and sometimes they just want them to focus on the credibility of the witness and not think too deeply about the exact testimony that they're providing, and therefore add distractions and so forth into the situation. And so that's using the elaboration likelihood model. That's the first question. Where are they going to be? And if there's nothing I can do about it, then I know I'm going to try to use cues for this audience, or use arguments. But I can say, well, if I want to use cues, or I need to, or I want to use arguments, then I'll think about, how do I push them higher on the continuum, or how do I get them lower on the continuum, so the influence will be more cue-based.
And Rich, in what you were just discussing, you were acknowledging the reality that some of these things you can change if you're trying to persuade people, and some of them you kind of have to accept that this isn't going to be easily changed. Now, is it true that if you can, you'd rather have individuals think about things more deeply, or does it really depend on what the goal of your persuasion is in the first place? Because I think, like jury behavior, you want them to vote a particular way. What happens after that? Imagine you don't much care. So, you talk about in the ELM how deep level thinking stimulates more profound and stable change. But I imagine that the importance of that to an individual may depend on the context, right?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a really good example of the jury case. And so if you just thought about how long the attitude lasts, you might say, well, I don't need the attitude to last for weeks, because they're going to go, and most juries decide in the same day, right? But there's a second feature that thought gives you, and that's the ability to resist, even in the short term, people who are making the opposite case. So let's say I go in there and I'm thinking the person's innocent, right? But I haven't thought about it that deeply. That's just my impression, because I like the way they looked and whatever. And then someone starts making an argument based on the evidence that, no, they're guilty, and here's why, and there's this and there's that. I'm at a loss, because all I have are simple cues.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though you don't care if the attitude persists over weeks, I do need it to resist attack. And so that's a second feature. So even in those cases, you want thoughtful persuasion where there's the possibility of resistance. The one case, and maybe some of the audience are familiar with Bob Cialdini's famous 6 principles, or 7, I think he's up to 7 now, principles of persuasion, and or influence. He doesn't call it persuasion, influence. And he refers to all of them as heuristics, and they are, like scarcity, and so they would all fall on the low end of thinking, and he acknowledges that. But what he is focused on mostly is trying to get somebody to agree to something in the moment. Mm-hmm. Will you drive me to the airport? I'm a door-to-door salesman. Will you sign right now? And so forth. And there's no one going to come along who's going to counter-argue whatever this person is presenting. And I want the salesperson to go away as soon as possible. And so scarcity becomes a great heuristic, right? This is your last chance to get it. And I go, oh, I better do it right now before the salesman leaves. And so being in a high thought situation is not the best necessarily, because if I thought about it a lot, I'd become, well, why do I really need this? And what good is it going to do for me? And relying on, attractiveness and liking and authority and scarcity. And I miss some of the heuristics, but those are cases where it's, just as the elaboration likelihood model would say, if it's a short-term decision, it doesn't matter 2 weeks from now, what happens? I'm going to decide right now. And so it's interesting for that very reason that many states, or maybe all states, have this 3-day period where you can change your mind, right? Because they realize people can fall for these heuristics in the short term, and then later think about it. And so before that, it's like, you signed the contract today, you did it. My heuristics worked. Low thought influence was what was wonderful in that context. And so that's a good example. Then there are cases where, like in the advertising world, where every company knows, you're going to see McDonald's ads today, and then you're going to see Wendy's ads tomorrow, and then you're going to see some other fast food the next day. And so it's almost impossible for you not to get attacking advertisements, right? So they almost built into the system. They know that what we're doing is, I need to get you happy about Domino's Pizza, like right now, so you might order one today. And I know there are going to be other pizza commercials and deals and so forth. And so repetition and low thought persuasion is built into the system, right? Whereas in politics, like presidential candidates, they want longer term. They don't, I mean, even though they get lots of ads, they don't want you bouncing around, and they know they can't, even though that does happen among the small degree of people who end up determining the outcomes of elections, that 7% that can't make up their mind, and they just keep bouncing back and forth from ad to ad, whatever sounds best at the time. So there are some times where low thought persuasion is okay and maybe the way to go, but most of the time, if you can, it seems beneficial to have a more thoughtful influence.
And I think, Rich, that's particularly true in organizational contexts where, you could be a leader in an emergency context or something where, persuading people to make the decision that you think is right is crucial, and it's very short term. But in general, when we're working with other people or leading other people, it's like, yeah, I care about tomorrow, but we're working together for a long time over many, many different episodes, and the continuity of our attitudes and the ability, for individuals, if you're a leader, to like kind of get the message and let's make decisions based on that seems much more suited toward the deeper level thinking. And I also think a lot of cynicism is like, and I think as a leader at times, I say the right things at the time, but if you don't execute, it's like you don't have any credibility anymore. And so I do think that more stable, deeper, level of thinking, and therefore changes, it's, I think, more organizationally relevant, even though you can't think of examples where, the next hour is what you care about. But in general, I think it's the longer term, don't you?
Yeah. Yes. Most times.
Yeah.
For most consequential things, it's the long term. Sometimes short term decisions happen, but it's not the norm, I think.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing is, yesterday President Biden gave like a major economic policy address, and it always makes me wonder in these times, like how much people really actually listen to these things and pay attention. But I think, I know a lot of the application of ELM has been many different domains, but one of it has been in political discourse. And, I could imagine listening to you thinking, well, probably his advisors would say, well, we know a lot of people aren't going to pay attention, but the ones who do and processes it, there's going to be a stickiness to that and maybe a translation into their actual behavior. And so when you're a leader, I think probably a sophisticated leader, it's like you do really have to, if you're applying the model, you do have to think about the context a lot, and the audience.
You do. I mean, first thing is, how likely are people to think about my message? And I think, as we think about from when I started my work on this to now, there's so many changes in how people get their information, right? From the 3 television networks, and so, or a presidential speech, the tens of millions of people who would watch a presidential speech, right? And they'd all see the same thing. Whereas That doesn't happen today, even for the most important speeches like the State of the Union. People get their information in very short bites on social media and so forth. And so that has made thoughtful persuasion much more difficult than it used to be. I remember, when we used to do research with undergraduates, you could give them a 3-page message and they would read it and process it. And now you can see they're just like, what is this? I don't have time for this. You need to, a whole different way of presenting information. You need to present arguments in little sound bites and in short bits.
We had a really great chief marketing officer here at Ohio State for a while, and she said that if it isn't visual, and if it isn't short, it's not going to be read by your typical audience nowadays. And so you touched on this, Rich, but how does that, change in technology? How does it affect, are there things when you want to engage people in deeper level thinking that you can do, given that you realize, like in the age of Instagram and TikTok and Twitter, the short, visually appealing messages are what are winning most people's attention?
Yeah, you have to be much more flashy today, right? And so the substance of what was true 30 years ago is still true today. I think that simple cues matter when you're not thinking, and substance matters more when you're thinking. But how you present that substance, how you get it to break through, it's presented much more differently today. And so in our own research, if we gave the messages for the high thought conditions, the same ones we used 20 years ago, it just wouldn't happen. Students couldn't take it in. We would do it quite differently. And then the second thing that matters is because students are taking in information in such short bites, and not just students, but the whole world is taking information in such short bites. I think the importance of cues has become much more important, and I think we see that in things like identity politics, right? That people are the first thing, instead of asking themselves, well, which arguments are better, which has the best side, that's not the first question. It's which side is saying that. Is it my side or is it the other side? And so people, I think, identity has become much more important because people are paying less attention to the substance, right? That they have this preset idea of what side that they want to be right. It's certainly true in politics. There's no doubt that it's true in politics. I'd be curious as to whether or not the same is true in other domains, like in marketing or brands of people. We think about, I'm an Apple person, or I'm a PC person, or whatever. That used to be a thing. I don't know if the same is true there, where people adopt.
I do think it is, I think, really interesting and relevant. I know there have been quite a few articles on the ELM and COVID and vaccinations and all that. It's just, to me, really relevant because, when we look back in history, I think we'll look at many things that transpired. And I'm personally like a political moderate, so I'll try not to offend anyone. But I do think you just look at between I think so much of what our leaders were trying to do was persuade us to change our behavior, and I think you could imagine. And again, there have been, I think, I've seen a few really interesting articles on this, how knowing the ELM or looking at it through that lens, particularly with vaccinations and so forth, that could have benefited, I think, things a lot.
Yeah, there are things that used to be universals, like 30 years ago. One of the strongest sources you could use for something is say, doctors say X, and that would be, oh, okay. And the COVID pandemic sort of showed us how it mattered more. Well, what side is that doctor on? Are they a Republican or a Democrat doctor, or what are they advocating? Do they And that was never the case. So people have their own arguments that they find persuasive. They have their own cues. And so doing this research just requires a lot more in-depth knowledge of your audience, as opposed to in the past, we'd have the universal cues and the universal strong arguments and whatever. And so one of the big principles of persuasion, of course, is matching. That the more you can do is to match the source to the audience, or match the arguments to the audience. And that used to be easier because you could say in general, well, for an American audience, these are the sources that everyone admires, and these are the arguments that people would find compelling. And so there was always a matching, but it's just become much more important to tailor things. But as it turns out, in this internet age, that's exactly what advertisers have figured out, that they don't do such a great job, as far as I can tell, in tailoring. It's just like, oh, you're interested in shoes, so I'll give you a shoe ad. But they could be so much more effective in tailoring because they know a lot more about the audience than they want shoes. They know their values and their interests and their politics, and maybe this is happening. But tailoring the right cues to the right people and the right arguments to the right people, by right, the matched ones, one could. And so one can imagine that's just, with artificial intelligence and so forth, just going to become crazy over the next 10 years, in terms of how, with laser light accuracy, that we'll get targeted based on what companies know about us.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if you can train Chat GPT to okay, here's the characteristics of the audiences, and adapt the message
Yep.
To them.
I'm sure it'll happen.
Yep. So the last question I have, Rich, is that, I think one of the implications, given what we've talked about the ELM, is to really train all of us at times, when we're interacting with others. Very often we're interested in persuading other people. It's a pretty fundamental dynamic, I think, between us. And I think one of the implications of the ELM is to kind of, it's not a cookbook. It's more, think about almost like a behavioral scientist, with some cues in mind that will help you to think about the audience. So do you think that's true? And do you have any other parting words of wisdom for people who have never really thought much about persuasion before, attitude change, and how they can be more effective at it?
Well, maybe as a parting comment, one of the exciting things to me is that at one point I thought, well, we've explored, everything there is to know over the past 30 years, all the sources and messages and techniques and so forth. But because of changing technology and the way in which people take information in, and the fact that people are polarizing into different camps, it's interesting for me to use the Elaboration Likelihood Model to think about new variables, things that we hadn't thought about before, but that are apropos to the current time. So for example, in the early research, we kind of assumed, well, people are generally open to new information, right? And if you give them a good argument and they're thinking about it, that's pretty good. But over time, people have become less open to information, especially if they know from the get-go that it's counter-attitudinal, that you're going to, I'm against the COVID vaccine, and you're going to try to, bully me or push me into getting vaccinated. I'm just not going to stand for that. And so there's more about that, even on topics like vaccinations that didn't used to be controversial, right? So people are more resistant to influence. And so I think, and it started already, but I think there's going to be a whole new wave of research on that step before you even get to the persuasive message. And that's, how do you get people to be open to even listening? And going back to the Hovland studies in the 1950s, that the first stage was always exposure to information, right? And right now, people are choosing to only expose themselves to things that they already agree with, right? Whether it's news outlets or so their selective exposure, which was known for a long time. But then we went through an age of mass media where everyone was kind of being exposed to the same thing. And so the big question was like, well, assuming you're going to be exposed to it, what kind of information should I present to you? And now we're going back and looking at some of those old models and saying, oh, that first step is really important. If all you're watching is this station or that station, I'm never gonna be able to get my information to you. And then even if I can present an advertisement for a Democrat on Fox News or a Republican on MSNBC, if I can put my ads there and buy the time, I don't want you just immediately to tune out and say, well, this is the time for a restroom break, or this is the time to, change the channel. I need to get you open to influence. And so I think that's an exciting area of research that's really just in its infancy right now.
Well, the theory is alive and well. So, Rich, thanks so much for joining us. It's been fun and a pleasure, and I'm confident this will help students and those wanting to further refine their leadership skills, be better communicators and better at persuasion and influence. So thanks for sharing your expertise with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Tim. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks again for listening. This podcast is presented by the Max M. Fisher College of Business at The Ohio State University. For more episodes, find us on Apple, Google, or podcast.osu.edu/leadership initiative. See you next time.